Well, thank you. Of course, it's always an enormous pleasure to be in New York for any excuse, any time, any season. But it's especially great right now to come to NYU. NYU is doing so much, and believe me, there's lots of talk in China, and specifically at the university that was hosting me, Tsinghua, about NYU Shanghai, and they're very interested in what kind of competitor it's going to be and how it will change the landscape of Chinese academics. So I'd like to start talking from the third plenum, because obviously this is one of those landmark events that are going to determine how we look at China, in particular Chinese economic policy, for a long time to come. But before we start talking about the third plenum specifically, let me just take 2 minutes to set the scene. And some of this, since I'm going to do this quickly, some of this will just be super quick judgments that not everybody might agree with, but still I'll lay them on the table so you know where I'm coming from. Number one, China, of course, is a huge overall success in terms of economic reform, but when we look at the last 10 years, we see a clear stalling out of the economic reform process. And especially since 2008, 2009, most people think there's been regression. At the same time as this regression, the leaders of China have continued to talk about how important reform is. So there's been almost no adjustment of the overall rhetoric of the Chinese leadership in terms of reform, even while the on-the-ground reality has changed very dramatically. And the result of this disconnect, this continuing allegiance to reform while the actual process of reform has stalled out, has been an almost total loss of belief in the rhetoric of the Chinese leadership in fostering reform. In other words, reform has faced a crisis of confidence and a crisis of credibility. So one thing, I think we're at the beginning of a very big, important day with lots of interesting contributions. I suggest one thing we do right at the beginning is pause for a second, look inside yourself, identify the deep skepticism that you feel about Chinese reform statements, and then recognize that's not just something you feel, that's something that everybody feels. Not just here in this room, but in China as well. You see that when you think about the reform, when you suggest to people in China that large-scale economic reforms are possible, the first reaction you'll get in almost all cases is, really? Can we do it? Can we overcome entrenched interest groups? Can we create our future? Can we move forward? And so it's this credibility crisis and this paradox, right? Because it's a paradox because just at the moment when the outside world fully acknowledges the astonishing magnitude of the Chinese economic achievement over the last couple decades, it's at exactly this time that this sense of credibility crisis seeps into the discourse and the belief of most people. But in this context, the third plenum is then the best opportunity to reverse this kind of credibility crisis. If the new leadership in China, the Xi Jinping, Li Keqiang leadership, was going to be able to reverse this feeling of loss of confidence, the best opportunity was at the third plenum in November. And basically what they had to do was, of course, first prevent further backsliding, right? Reverse this perception of a disconnect between words and deeds. And in particular then, they had to do 3 things at this plenum. Number one, they had to start movement. They had to provide some deliverables. Number 2, they had to restore credibility in the leadership's commitment to the reform process and in the possibility of forward movement. And number 3, they had to begin to build some momentum. So you notice all of the things I'm talking about in this initial state are about belief, movement, and policy credibility. And the key importance of this crucial meeting was further raised by the enormous visibility that the leadership gave it in the run-up to the meeting. Of course, those of you who are China hands, you all know the historical importance of various third plenums in the past. And then in addition, the leadership kept raising the stakes, right, signaling that this was the unveiling of their new reform program. So, did they do it? The short answer is yes. In other words, whatever your beliefs are about how feasible economic reform is in China, the likelihood of serious economic reform substantially increased after the third plenum. Even if you're a deep skeptic, you have to acknowledge that there's a little bit less grounds for skepticism. And if you're a strong optimist, then your optimism has been confirmed. Now, I think when we look at the third plenum document, if we look at it through this lens of a policy response to a credibility crisis environment, then we can understand a lot better what's going on in this document. Because, you know, again, I think you know what the document is, right? It's the outcome of a consensus building process. It's not very long, and it has to go through multiple cycles of consultation. So one thing we know for absolute sure, it's going to be relatively vague. It's going to have lots of statements of principle. But within that process, what we see is an absolutely astonishing document and a quite remarkable outcome. And here are 5 reasons why this document and the whole overall process is crafted in a way to rebuild this sense of credibility and momentum. Number 1, breadth. This is a shock and awe document. The whole purpose of it is to lay out a great big range of things. It has 60 articles, but that's not even really true, because under each article, there are typically several specific policies that are going to be adopted. There are, by my count, more than 300 different measures named and listed in this document under these 60 items. And although certainly the center of it is economics, it's by no means limited to economics. And of course, we will be aware that there are headlines that came out of this meeting having to do with relaxing the birth control policy, eliminating reform through labor, setting up a new national security commission, et cetera, et cetera. It certainly extends well beyond pure economics, but at the core of it is economics. So clearly, one intention of this document is just to say, you want to know if we're serious? Boom. Here's how you can see we're serious. Number 2, observability. The document certainly has plenty of broad, abstract points, but it also has tens of specific, monitorable commitments. Example, state firms are going to remit 30% of their dividends to the government by 2020. In itself, that's not a big deal. It's kind of important, though. Why is it in there? Because it's something you can check me on if I'm the leader. It's a commitment I can make that's easy for you to verify. The document doesn't avoid difficult territory. It's quite specific, as we'll see in a second, on state-owned enterprises. It's quite specific on land, even when it's not necessarily successful. It approaches closely to the areas where there's the most resistance, where there's the most controversy, in order to show that it's trying to create a situation of forward momentum. As if all this wasn't enough, as soon as the meeting had closed, as soon as the document was issued, Xi Jinping issued 2 articles, one of which essentially said, and forgive me if I'm slightly disrespectful here, one of which essentially says, I did all this myself. I presided over the meeting. I chaired the writing group. In other words, Xi Jinping created an unusually high degree of personal identification between his leadership and the measures in the document, obviously designed to say, hey, this has high-level backing. I'm committed to it. If stuff doesn't happen, that reflects on my leadership. And finally, they set up a very high-level leadership small group to coordinate the implementation of this. So all these things were designed to achieve momentum and credibility and forward movement. Now, let's look at the document. Of course, 300 items, my God, you know, there's an enormous amount of stuff in there. There isn't even an authoritative English translation yet. And even if we had an English translation, it's not necessarily that valuable because so much of the action comes in the sort of precise positioning of each individual item. Is it a plan for reform? Is it a so-called top-level design? No, not quite. They weren't able to quite get there. I think the way to look at it is it's a vision statement plus a to-do list, right? It sketches out a couple of clear visions, and then it lays out literally hundreds of actions that need to be taken, driven by problems, fundamentally, in order to move forward. So with all this material, how can we look at it? I suggest let's look at a couple of clusters. Here's one that I think is very important and where a lot of the action in the document takes place. State ownership and corporate governance. Some of you will be aware that state ownership has been, you know, kind of raised in appreciation in China lately. 20 years ago, state ownership was a problem. These days, state ownership is one of the pillars of Communist Party governance. Nonetheless, the document pushes hard in the area of state ownership to make progress. It says existing state-owned enterprises will finally be converted into joint stock corporations with transparent corporate governance systems. That's not anything really new, but what it is the revitalization of a stalled-out agenda from Zhu Rongji's era, a crucial center point for other things that have to happen. It makes a remarkably strong commitment to what it calls mixed ownership systems, meaning that once firms are all converted to corporations, that mixed ownership, including mixed ownership in which private parties can sometimes have a controlling interest, will be the predominant form. And government management of its ownership stake will increasingly be done at an arm's length basis as a kind of portfolio management of national wealth. There's a distinction in the document. Unfortunately, it really doesn't translate very well. It's the distinction from managing assets to managing capital, from zichan to ziban. You know, in English, there's not a whole lot of distinction between those two terms. But in the context that the document is working in, it clearly means getting the government out of direct management of specific corporate decision-making and shift to a, as I say, kind of arm's length portfolio management. So that's a remarkable cluster of commitments. You know, each one is sort of spelled out in a separate section. But when you put them together, they represent a clear movement towards a very different, revitalized policy for state ownership. A similar area, one thing you might think of as in some ways one of the major themes of the whole document, is in terms of the role of government and the relationship between government and the market. Again, there's 10 or 20 specific items that are laid out in order to support this general vision, which is greater role for markets, reduced government intervention in microeconomic decision-making, reversing the current situation of a government that intervenes too much but doesn't regulate effectively enough. And just to pick one theme among many in these, it's the idea of a negative list. This is something that's already been tried out in the Shanghai Free Trade Zone. Basic idea that you lay out a list of things where there are restrictions, and then everything else is open. In other words, it's an attempt to get at the problem of excessive government regulation excessive government controls that essentially say in order to do anything, you need government approval. If there's anything in the document that's strong, it's the idea that this type of presumption that government approval is necessary has to be reversed. And so let me just pick out 3 ways in which this negative list thing appears, right? The first time it's introduced, just stated as a general principle that we will move to a negative list system so that private businesses can do everything that's not on the negative list. We will consider moving to a negative list system for foreign businesses too. And then buried away in item number 35 is this idea that we're going to come up with a list of local government authorities. The local governments will have to specify what powers they have and how they intend to operate them. And if government action doesn't fall onto this list, it will not be permitted. Now, I don't see that as being a very effective means to achieve that goal, but it's a very important contribution to an overall commitment to try and redefine what Chinese governments do, and especially what Chinese local governments do. A similar cluster of things, but one I think that's less successful, is looking at the urban and rural divide, and in particular, the way that the urban-rural divide affects the land system. They couldn't quite come up with a breakthrough here, but they didn't back away from it either. So you have a series of partial provisions about land, about rural land, that's designed to make it more marketable, to make more of the income go to individuals, and to reduce the control of local governments in the requisition and the allocation of land without recompense. There are many, many other interesting areas in the document. Let me just really quickly flag 2. The fiscal system, where the document makes a clear sort of overall commitment to have the central government take over certain kinds of expenditure responsibility while keeping the basic distribution of income between center and local more or less stable. And there's some very, very interesting parts of the document on the social governance system that essentially acknowledges a greater role for nonprofit organizations, for what we might call civil society, even while other parts of the Chinese government have been criticizing the concept of civil society quite harshly lately. So there's lots and lots in this document that's extremely valuable. Now, let's look forward. There's so much material in here. What's going to happen next? There are a couple of milestones we can look for: the new leadership group, the Economic Work Conference this month, and the National People's Congress in March or April. We expect to see, I think, significant movement over the next 6 months. Just this week, we saw the Securities Regulatory Commission announce not just that IPOs would resume next year, but that they would adopt a system of simple registration for IPOs. In other words, completely consistent with not only a specific provision in this document, but this overall spirit that IPOs would simply need to register and disclose information. When they do that, they're allowed to start the IPO process. No longer would the Securities Regulatory Commission vet make judgments about the adequacy and the professionalism and the appropriateness of individual companies. That would instead be left to the market. So we see movement. We see activity already happening. But clearly there are also risks. In terms of the key types of risk that I was laying out in this presentation, the first, of course, is the danger that the process will get bogged down, right? Precisely because so much has been laid out in this document, there's a danger that there won't be large enough breakthroughs in any particular area. Here's the other big risk, I think, the second of 3, is the risk that this broad-based economic reform program will be overtaken by difficulties in the financial system. And I've got to say, talking to a lot of economists over the last 2 months in China, this is the area where I think there's the least consensus. Many, many people believe that the Chinese financial system is fine and there are no problems. And many, many people believe that the Chinese financial system is in an extremely precarious position. And I think the fundamental issue here is the Chinese financial system is adapting very quickly to a dramatically new set of conditions. There's lots and lots of transactions taking place outside the standard bank credit system. Interest rates are going up. Banks are becoming more leveraged. New financial instruments are being used to provide liquidity throughout the system. In my view, the basic cause of this problem is that so much bank credit is tied up in non-performing, local government-sponsored investment vehicles, most of which were created during the global financial crisis in 2009, 2010. I think this does create a very substantial measure of risk because the system's just not well adapted to dealing with situations where the liquidity of these different financial instruments is thrown into question. And we saw this briefly in late June, where interest rates spiked in a situation where the central bank wasn't ready to intervene and provide liquidity. The situation right now is different because the central bank is providing liquidity, but even so, interest rates are going up, and even so the reliability of some of these instruments is quite questionable. So I think there's a very significant worry that this program will be derailed if something dramatic happens either inside or outside China that ripples through to the Chinese financial system. Risk 3, reforms might fail. And I mean this in a very specific sense, that the leadership might be able to follow through with all these different measures designed to pull government back from its intervention into markets. And although they might have some effect, it won't be enough to prevent clever people, clever regulators, or clever politicians from manipulating markets in ways that benefit them, that keep corruption high, and keep the benefits of a highly efficient market economy elusive. So I think we have all three of those risks in front of us. Clearly that means that while we're in an environment in which reforms are clearly going forward, the risks that reforms will in fact be successfully carried out over these next few years are still quite high. Now I actually went ahead and made a few simple, one simple suggestion, because it seems to me the fundamental problem that faces what is laid out in the reform document in the third plenum resolution is that it doesn't have prioritization, it doesn't have sequencing. And so all these forms of risks are in some sense a reflection of the fact that in order to achieve broad movement, the reform document had to sacrifice a high degree of priority to any particular actions. So I suggest that the new leadership small group set up a national wealth task force, because there's already in the document a very implicit vision of this restructuring of national wealth. They set up a national wealth task force that would give a high priority, high visibility item, and you could do two things with it. You'd have a national wealth restructuring safety group, which takes as its core task beginning to carry out the orderly liquidation of some of the worst of these local government financial vehicles, work through some bond refinancing, work through some orderly defaults, and be ready in case anything more unexpected happens in the overall financial market. At the same time, you could use another part of this group to greatly accelerate that kind of restructuring of state ownership that's already called for in the document. The restructuring of state ownership strikes me as the single most important way in which reforms could either stall out or be accelerated. If we give back to the state agency that runs state firms the mandate to carry out this reform, it will stall out. Because this agency, SASC, the State Asset Supervision and Administration Commission, was in charge of this reform agenda in the first place. But it seems to me what we could do now is take what's already in the document, use it to split up SASC into 3 different or 4 different investment funds, charge the investment funds with the responsibility for fulfilling the conversion to joint stock corporations, and then allow the investment funds to compete with each other in terms of rate of return. That would mean putting top leadership muscle behind the immediate acceleration of the reform process and breaking through the danger of stagnation caused by bureaucratic foot dragging. 2 additional principles: establish that boards of directors make the personnel decisions, and establish the principle that state ownership doesn't take controlling stakes in competitive industries. Again, that's something that runs through the document but needs a precise definition. And of course, we have to see work going forward on many other fields as well. So I'm going to wrap up here because David has instructed me to keep it short and sweet and leave plenty of time for discussion. But let me just say one quick conclusion then about what the document does and doesn't provide. As I say, it's a vision statement with a to-do list. Some of the things on that to-do list won't get done, but a lot of them will. The vision is probably a little bit too distant at this time to count as a real driver organizing a reform process. But it seems to me undeniable that the third plenum has clearly started a process. And it's a process that is now increasingly creating momentum. And momentum means that the incentive structure of local government officials, central government officials, and even to a certain extent business people has been dramatically altered. With that alteration comes movement, serious, real movement for what will turn out to be a long-term, difficult, complex, and not necessarily successful, but very important round of fundamental economic reform.
Okay. Thank you, Barry.